Welcome again, guys, to another episode of Learn the TOEFL the Easy Way with Teacher Fish. So, our lesson for today is going to be about the last task of the TOEFL speaking section, which is called Academic Lecture. Before we begin our lesson, let me first take this opportunity to thank each one of you for helping this channel reach 100 subscribers. It has motivated me a lot to make more TOEFL videos and exercises so that I can be a part of your TOEFL success. For those of you who have not subscribed yet, please help my channel reach 1000 subs. And I promise to help you with your TOEFL journey. And so, to start with our lecture, Speaking Task 4, being the last task of speaking is kind of unique. Well, it is unique in the sense that, although it is still an integrated task, you only have to do two things, which are to listen and to speak. The listening part, specifically lecture, will provide all necessary details that you'll need in your response. This means that, like the first two integrated speaking tasks, there should not be any details or information included in your answer, aside from what you hear from the professor. In this task, you will hear a part of a professor's lecture on practically any major field of academic study, but will focus on a detailed aspect of the field. The professor's lecture will usually be divided into introduction and two major details. The lecture would normally include terminologies that might be unfamiliar to you. But, do not worry, the task does not expect you to have knowledge of these technical terms. However, having a good amount of vocabulary would be very useful with the task. After listening to the lecture, as test taker, your task is to summarize the content. Another thing to note in this task is the time limits involved. The first thing to know is that the professor's lecture would normally take about 90 to 120 seconds. Then after you read the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response. How you should prepare your response will be discussed later on the video. Finally, for the response time, you are still allowed to speak for 60 seconds. Remember, in all speaking tasks, anything that is spoken beyond the response time limit will not be recorded, so always make sure that you finish speaking before the limit expires. So let us now move to the note-taking process. As mentioned earlier in the video, Speaking Task 4 expects you to focus on three main things: the main idea and the two major details. However, and needless to say, the major details also require their supporting details. So your paper should look like this. Main idea. Major detail 1. Minor detail 1. Minor detail 2. If necessary. Major detail 2. Minor detail 1. Minor detail 2. If again, necessary. Now remember, a lecture that runs for at least 1.5 minutes will contain much information. So this means, most of the time, your response will contain a lot of details. So instead of explaining what each of the fields in the diagram is, which I am pretty sure you have a full grasp of, we will instead focus on how accurately you can take note of each of them. Let us begin with the main idea. To accurately determine the main idea, and remember that it would include the topic and its controlling idea, pay attention to the start of the lecture. Normally, a professor would immediately begin his or her talk with it. However, there is still a possibility that he would conduct a review of previous lesson, so listen carefully at the expressions that he or she uses. For example, he or she might begin by saying, "Previously, we discussed," or, "Today, we will focus on." Next, if you hear the professor mention a technical term, note it down. It is not important if you are familiar with it. It doesn't even matter if you spelled it correctly. Remember, you are the only one who can see your paper and that it won't even be a part of your score. And so, if for example, the professor mentions the term pterophyllum, and you are unfamiliar with how it is spelled, write it accordingly to how it was said by the professor. So on your paper it might look like T-E-R-O-F-Y-L-M. At times, the professor might begin by asking a question. For example, if the topic of the lecture is about pop art, he might start the lecture by saying, "When you think of pop art, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?" Probably the image on a Campbell soup can, right? But what is pop art? In the series of questions, we can anticipate that the topic of his lecture is about pop art. Then the series of questions are typically followed by a statement that contains the controlling idea or the point or points that the professor will discuss in his lecture. It might again sound like, well, first we have to understand the origin of the movement. So upon listening to the first few lines of the professor's lecture, we now have an entry for our main idea part. How pop art started. Next, the major detail, similar to speaking task 3, is a statement that directly talks about one of the points introduced in the main idea. So again, if the main idea is about the origin of pop art, the first major detail will talk about this. Let's say, the professor continued with his lecture by saying, in the 1950s a bunch of artists, who called themselves as the Independent Group, or IG, met in London to discuss about modernist art. So from this statement from the professor's lecture, we can say that the first major detail would be about a group of artists in London called the Independent Group. So on paper you must have the words, Independent Group from London. So the next thing that must be on your paper is the supporting detail or supporting details that would expound on your first major point. This is again where the professor would go into specific details. Here is a pro tip. Since this is the part of the professor's lecture where you will hear a lot of information, when note-taking, try to use abbreviations to cut the time spent on writing. You may even use symbols, but be sure you'd understand them when you give a response. For example, instead of writing the word Philippines, you could simply write Phil. Likewise, instead of writing has increased, why not draw an arrow facing up? Supporting detail 1 might also be an explanation, an example, or other similar types of details. Let's again have this part from the professor's lecture. It says, members of the IG noticed the increased sophistication of American commercial art and wondered why the art world considered it lowbrow. During their first meeting, artists presented their works of collages, comic books and that kind of thing. The supporting details that you should have on paper are, why they met to discuss American commercial art, and why they displayed collages and comic books. As for the second major detail, the second point of the main idea, and supporting detail or details 2, which are the specific details for major detail 2, the same should be done as major and supporting details 1. However, the key for this task is how accurately you take notes of details and how completely you are able to present them in the response. And so, let me again give you some tips. Aside from abbreviations and symbols, listen to the transition words or signal expressions that the professor uses. These expressions are often followed by important information. So it would be wise if you note-take of these details. Next, be keen at the professor's tone of voice. When you hear him or her emphasize on certain parts of the lecture, take note of them. They are going to be important pieces of the response. Finally, the technical terms and advanced vocabulary that the professor includes in the lecture might be useful too. As said earlier, it is not important if you misspell the term, as long as you would be able to pronounce them accordingly to how the professor did. Lastly, try to focus on the ending part of the professor's lecture. Sometimes the professor wraps his lecture up with a summary of the information he discussed. This would be very helpful because, as you may already know, a summary contains important details. So this is a good hint of what you are supposed to focus on once you give your response. By the way, here is another pro tip. Not all the time, the professor will use strong signal words. In this situation, or every time you perform a speaking task 4, it would be best to take notes in linear fashion. It would facilitate easier organization of details once you are in the preparation part of the task. Before we move to our next lesson, let us again have a quick review of what you should have on paper. First is the main idea statement, which includes the topic and the controlling idea. Next is the first major detail, the first point that the professor discusses. Then, the supporting detail or details for the first major detail. Moving on to the second major detail, and finally, the supporting detail or details. Remember, the supporting details are commonly an explanation, an example, or other similar types. Now, let us talk about how you need to prepare your response. Remember again that you are only given 20 seconds to prepare a response for speaking task 4. You have to again be wise in budgeting your time here because you have to do multiple things despite having all the details you need. First, you have to organize the details you took notes of. Then, you have to paraphrase them. Remember that the TOEFL will not give you a perfect score if you simply copy the details from both sources. So this is where a big chunk of your preparation time will be consumed. Okay. To help you organize the details and prepare your response, here is a template that you can use. Starting with a statement that talks about the main idea of the lecture. It can be said as, the lecture discusses, then the main idea. Reminder, the main idea has to have a topic and controlling idea or ideas. Also keep in mind, that a task 4 response often contains a lot of information, so it would be a time saver if you could make use of a simple sentence when talking about the main idea. Then, major detail 1 immediately follows. It can again be like, first, the professor mentions that, then the major detail. Again, make use of your word substitute. Be sure that the word you chose agrees with the type of lecture that the professor had. Next is, the supporting statement or statements for major detail 1. Again, it can be said as, he or she explains that, followed by the detail. Make use of your noun-pronoun combination when talking about a minor detail. Instead of saying the professor again, substitute it with a pronoun, he or she. Keep in mind that your working vocabulary is tested in speaking task 4. Moving on to our next sentence, the second major detail. It may sound like, second, the professor also says, then followed again by the point that was discussed. Now, we just talked about the use of vocabulary, then why is it that our second major detail still uses, the professor? To clear things out, in such a short response, source words, or for this matter, the professor, if repeated but not more than twice, is fine. Anyway, if you'd notice we used the word lecture when we introduced the main idea, instead of saying it came from the professor. Also, altering the source word when speaking of the major details might build a little confusion among the listeners. And besides, there are other parts of the response where you can showcase your wide vocabulary bank. Anyway, finally we have the supporting detail or details for the second major point. It may be like, he or she then points out, then the detail. Now, if in case you have to make use of multiple details as support, make sure to use transitional expressions that would enable a smooth transfer to the next sentence. So these are the elements of a speaking task 4 response, and the template that we have, is how you are supposed to organize the response. Before we end the video, let us again have a quick rundown of the parts. Starting off with the statement that talks about the main idea of the lecture. Followed by the first major detail, then the supporting detail or details of major point 1. Next, major detail 2, and lastly, the support or supports of major detail 2. We have again reached the end of our lesson about speaking task 4. I hope that after watching the video, you now find it easier to answer the last task of the TOEFL speaking section. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave them on the comment section and I will do my best to respond to them promptly. I have also uploaded other TOEFL lesson videos and TOEFL exercises, so check out my channel. And please, do not forget to subscribe, press like, and hit the notification bell so that you'd get informed every time I upload a new video or practice exercises. You may also share this video with your friends and other test takers you know, so that they too can achieve their TOEFL success. And always remember, the TOEFL is not difficult, if you know what to do. With that, see you again on the next episode of Learn the TOEFL the Easy Way with Teacher Fish.